Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 269. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on Biden's disinformation board that he's putting together, and then, of course, a whole bunch of information on the war in Ukraine. So, share today's show. It's at the Libertarian Institute, YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version of the show. It's up everywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. There's a Facebook page. The Twitter handle is @con_interest, and I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. If you want to donate to the show, of course, you could support the Libertarian Institute, or we have a Patreon, Subscribe Star, and crypto. All that information is in the show notes page. And then we have a sponsor, the great CBD company Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEEPS. And very exciting news, I will be attending a Paloma Verde event this weekend in San Antonio. That will be May 7th. Will be the date of that event. So if you're in the San Antonio area this coming weekend, send me some kind of email or something, and I will get you in touch with Carlos and figure out how you can attend that event. I think it's going to be a real good time. Really excited, looking forward to it. But other than hosting great events, Paloma Verde makes great CBD. Their lab test results are right there on their website. I really like the sports cream. All the topicals that I've used at Paloma Verde have been absolutely fantastic. But the sports cream is by far my favorite. Just the menthol smell. You get a lot out of it. One bottle will last you a very long time. A good amount of pain relief, and then it's so much better than any of the other muscle creams that you're going to get at your local pharmacy. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE, that will save you 20%, and it gets the show a kickback. All right, now let's get into the news. First story I have today is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, writing, Biden administration comes under fire for forming Department of Homeland Security Disinformation Board. The Biden administration has come under heavy criticism for creating a disinformation governance board that falls under the Department of Homeland Security. The board has been slammed as Orwellian, as the board was formed to fight whatever the U.S. government considers disinformation. According to Politico, the board is meant to coordinate countering misinformation related to Homeland Security, focused specifically on irregular migration and Russia. And so very interesting that COVID doesn't get included here. My only guess is maybe Department of Homeland Security is just, immigration, Russia are top priorities. But to go on, so far the Biden administration hasn't put out much information on exactly what the board will do. When asked about it, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki didn't offer any details. I really haven't dug into this exactly. I mean, we of course support this effort because let me see if I could get more specifics. And so that's quite a lackluster response. President Biden appointed Nina Jankowicz as the head of the board, who previously worked as a disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center and advised the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry as a part of the Fulbright Public Policy Fellowship, a program ran by the State Department. Jankowicz also oversaw Russia and Belarus programs at the National Democracy Institute, a U.S.-funded non-governmental organization. Jankowicz's appointment comes as the United States is significantly escalating its support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Part of the Biden administration campaign against Moscow includes information warfare. Earlier this month, U.S. officials told NBC News that the Biden administration has been putting out information related to Russia's war effort based on bad intelligence as a part of information war against Russian President Vladimir Putin. As a part of this effort, the Biden administration has fed several stories to the press that were based on claims that had no evidence to back up. And I think I might have wrote about another one of those that we'll get into later in the show. But sticking with this board, particularly Jankowicz is an interesting choice. This is somebody who claimed the Hunter Biden laptop in 2020 was disinformation and shouldn't be viewed in anything like that, which of course has now come out and been extra super confirmed as all authenticated original emails. Now, that doesn't mean that every claim that somebody made based off of those emails are true. There's certain things, especially about the big guy, that are a little bit more assertions at this point. Now, have people done the same kind of journalism they did if Trump was president, this kind of information came out against him, I do think we would have come to those answers or been far closer to them about, what the president's role is in his son's businesses and business dealings, particularly of concern on this show for Ukraine. I really am not that concerned about Joe Biden's relationship with China. I don't think he's owned by the Chinese. If you look at his policy, very aggressive against China, and maybe it's slightly less thin than the claims that Trump was a Russian agent, but the idea of Beijing Biden is very, very absurd and thinly evidenced. And again, if you look at Biden's actual policy, it is in no way preferable towards China. So, the concern here, from my perspective, is that this is going to be used not just to control information and what the official narrative is, what the public is, allowed to consume, but then this is also either going to be used as a standard for these social media companies. So let's say this board says something is disinformation, then Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, everybody is going to slam that with the same warning and suppress the story. Now, I suppose that may not happen. Different social media companies may not go along with it. Of course, a lot of people have talked about Elon Musk buying Twitter, and I'm not going to get into a whole conversation with that on this show. I think, if there's any major announcement in Twitter policy change, that may be something I do cover on the show, but just simply Musk buying it in itself isn't anything that signifies any major change. And it might, we'll see, but I'm not going that far yet. So anyways, that's my concern, is that this is going to be used to universalize the narrative, not only on, what is the official government quote unquote truth, but also what isn't allowed and who's disinformation, which is, I think, almost more dangerous. So yeah, this is a real concern and something we definitely need to keep our eye on. Next story, Pentagon official says U.S. sees no threat of Russia using nuclear weapons. And this is interesting because, Russia has made some threats about their nuclear program, not necessarily that they're going to nuke Washington or anything that direct or specific, but just implying they could deploy more nuclear weapons, or that, of course, in certain situations, nuclear weapons could be used. And so we have here a senior Pentagon official told reporters on Friday that the U.S. does not believe there is a real threat of Russia using nuclear weapons. We continue to monitor the nuclear capabilities every day the best we can, and we do not assess that there is a threat of nuclear and no nuclear threat to NATO territory, the official said, speaking on condition of anonymity. So this statement is interesting, and in one sense, I'm almost concerned about it, because this, I think, is an effort by the Biden administration to play down the nuclear threat, to help prime Americans, or to get Americans past some of their concerns about more direct confrontation with Russia. And so playing down the nuclear issue means that, by their estimates and what they're saying, Ukraine could win the war, right? Ukraine doesn't maintain a nuclear arsenal, so it can't be Russia that way, they say. But all the weapons we're supplying in there could help the Ukrainians drive the Russians out. So this is interesting. Now, at the same time, it could be a real assessment. And I do think the likelihood that either side at this point uses nuclear weapons is still extremely low. These are such serious weapons, and And, not to give an endorsement of either Putin or Biden, but these are two leaders who have been around the nuclear issue for some time. And, have both when Biden took office, they immediately extended the New START treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms agreement between the US and Russia. And so I do think that, particularly Biden and Putin do understand the severity of the issue, the nuclear issue in particular. And so that may mean that there's really a much lower chance of nuclear weapons being used than, Russia has even, kind of suggested here with some of their warnings. Now, this is the story where I think maybe the U.S. could have stretched the intelligence again. This is from myself and Will Porter, writing at the Libertarian Institute on April 29th. Russian cyber attacks failed to materialize after Biden warned it's coming. 1 month after President Joe Biden warned Americans to prepare for cyber attacks from Russia, a U.S. official said Washington still has yet to see any direct attacks. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has assessed that Russia has not breached U.S. systems, with agency head Jen Easterly saying the administration has not seen any attacks manifest here. To date, we have not seen specific attacks on the U.S. What we are concerned about is the fact that Russia's malicious cyber activity is a part of their playbook. Easterly did mention that the American economic penalties on Russia could provoke a cyber attack in retaliation, despite the lack of such breaches to date. We are very concerned that as the war drags on, there may be, in fact, be retaliatory attacks given the very severe sanctions we have imposed on the Kremlin, the U.S., and our allies, the agency had continued, which is very interesting. That, she would acknowledge that if at this point, looking at these attacks, that would be a Russian retaliatory attack against the United States and not just, Russia attacking the U.S. out of nowhere. On a March 21st speech, Biden told Americans the magnitude of Russia's cyber capabilities is fairly consequential and it's coming. Ominous warning of a major hack on the horizon. The Biden administration has issued several similar threats that have failed to materialize. The White House has warned for months that Moscow could deploy chemical weapons and has even shipped protective equipment to Kiev's forces to prepare for such an attack. On April 6th, however, a series of unnamed U.S. officials told NBC News there is no evidence Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine, adding that Washington hurled the accusations to merely deter Russia from using the banned munitions. Now, I will say I have seen a somewhat concerning response from the foreign policy hawks on this story as well, where the reaction to this isn't necessarily like, oh, good, this hasn't happened. It's, hey, look, Russia's cyber capabilities are a hell of a lot weaker than people, have been warning about. And so does this mean that we have more leverage against Russia than we thought? And, that's actually happened with this Neds thing, too, where I have a story here from Dave DeCamp explaining how Russia says pumping weapons into Ukraine threatens Western security. And some people will note that Russia hasn't carried out mass attacks on U.S. weapon or Western weapon shipments into Ukraine. And that's some kind of sign that here we could carry out more attacks and gives the U.S. more leeway. And so, definitely in a way is disincentivizing Russia from waging a more aggressive, more broad reaching war, because everything that the Kremlin does that's anywhere near constrained is interpreted by the White House as weakness, and therefore the U.S. could be more aggressive. So Dave DeCamp writes here, as the U.S. and its allies are escalating military aid to Ukraine, Russia warned Thursday that pumping weapons into the country threatens the security of the European continent. This is from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson. In and of itself, the tendency to pump weapons, including heavy weapons, to Ukraine and other countries are actions that threaten the security of the continent and provoke instability. Since Russia invaded on February 24th, the U.S. has dumped billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine, but has shown little concern about where the weapons wind up. A source familiar with U.S. intelligence told CNN that when the U.S. weapons enter the country, Washington does not know where they go, describing it as dropping into a big black hole. The CNN report said that the Biden administration thinks the risk of weapons winding up in the wrong hands is worth it. In the previous years, Congress had tried to keep U.S. military aid to Ukraine out of the hands of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, but that concern has waned. Peskov's warning comes in response to comments from the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who said Wednesday that Western weapons should double down on pouring weapons into Ukraine by sending heavy equipment such as tanks and planes. In a recent escalation of military aid, the U.S. sent howitzers and artillery rounds to Ukraine for the first time. The Pentagon said Wednesday that Ukrainian troops have more than half of the 90 howitzers the U.S. has pledged to send. Now I want to talk about the $33 billion weapons package. I have an article here from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft by Ben Freeman and William Hartung titled Biden putting new whopping $33 billion Ukraine package into context. And so this is important because you hear the big $33 billion number, but not all of this is military aid, and there's some other stuff in here that's important. So today the Biden administration requested a whopping $33 billion aid package for Ukraine. This is on top of $14 billion in Ukrainian aid packages enacted last month. While the Russian aggression in Ukraine has been appalling in its violence, this is nonetheless a historically large aid package that is worth putting into context. For starters, if Congress signs off on the new request, the U.S. will have authorized $47 billion in total spending to Ukraine. That's more than the Biden administration is committing to stopping climate change and almost as much as the entire State Department budget. Also worth noting, we're creeping up on the entire Russian military budget for an entire year. I think is $60 to $66 billion at this point. And, I'm sure there's some black budget spending and everything like that as well. But anyways, the U.S. is looking at sending a lot of military aid to Ukraine. We're about halfway there, and this will get us through the end of September. So that's about 8 months. It's not that far off of the size of the Russian military budget. But back to the article here. The vast majority of the new aid package, $20.4 billion, is for additional security and military assistance for Ukraine and for the U.S. effort to strengthen security in cooperation with our NATO allies and other partners in the region. Coupled with the $3.7 billion in military assistance already available to Ukraine since the Russian invasion, President Biden's proposal of an additional $20 billion would make Kiev the largest yearly recipient of U.S. military aid of at least the past 2 decades, and that was somebody from the Stimson Center. The person continues, the amount of money is more than twice the largest yearly total ever provided to Afghanistan, where the U.S. was actively at war, and approximately 7 times Israel's annual military assistance package. The aid package is also more than the U.S. spent on the so-called Overseas Contingency Operations account during the first year of the U.S. conflict in Afghanistan, and more than the total amount of money all but 13 countries in the world spend on their military. In addition to Ukrainian fighters, one of the primary beneficiaries of this aid package will be the Pentagon contractors, who CEOs have explained how the Ukraine conflict is good for business and has seen their stock prices soar since the war began. According to Taylor Gorno of Open Secrets, the top 5 defense contractors have spent more than $16 million on lobbying in the first quarter of 2022 alone, and their CEOs met directly with the Pentagon leadership earlier this month to discuss Ukrainian security While Ukrainian fighters will benefit from these arms, it's virtually impossible for the U.S. to consider the risk of where these arms transfers. Well, not the least of which is the potential for the U.S. gain in direct military confrontation with Russia. As Seth G. Jones of the Strategic and International Studies told the New York Times, the risk of widening war is serious right now. Russian casualties continuing to mount, and the U.S. is committed to shipping more powerful weapons that are causing casualties. And this is just a side note here. Over the weekend, maybe this was in the middle of last week, the U.S. announced that it had provided Ukraine with battlefield intelligence that it's using to take out Russian troops, but also that Ukraine used the intelligence to take out a Russian troop transport plane, killing hundreds of Russian troops. These kinds of actions could eventually provoke some kind of retaliation from Moscow, if not, maybe targeting more Ukrainian cities, more Western Ukrainian cities, which, by the way, the US, UK, and other countries are now redeploying their diplomatic staff to Kiev. And so if Russia is carrying out strikes in Kiev, of course, there's risk of escalation there. Also, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi was in Kiev. I think it was today, May 1st. It might have been April 30th. The way they announce these trips, sometimes they don't tell you till after the person has already left. But anyways, Nancy Pelosi recently, they're joining, of course, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken as the recent visits to Kiev. Wrapping up with this article, though, there is also the possibility that U.S. arms will fall into the hands of adversaries, as they have in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere, in addition to the direct economic costs to U.S. taxpayers who ultimately have to foot the bill for this historic aid package. Part of the cost would come from special kinds of fraud, where waste and abuse, like groups like the Special Investigator for Afghan Reconstruction have uncovered in other cases where billions of dollars were being shoveled out the door in the name of national security without adequate oversight or coordination. Helping Ukraine defend itself is one thing, but it should be done with an eye towards limiting the risk of escalation and unintended consequences, economic and security wise. The administration's latest aid request should be carefully debated and scrutinized before it is allowed to sail through in its current form. And I, take a much harder stance against this aid package than Freeman and Harton do, but I really appreciate their breakdown on this. Now, Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Pentagon says the U.S. is training Ukrainian forces in Germany. The DoD announced on Friday that the U.S. has begun training Ukrainian forces in Germany on how to use advanced military equipment that Washington is providing to Kiev. This is from Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby. Today, I can announce that the United States has commenced training with Ukrainian armed forces on key systems at U.S. military installations in Germany. Kirby said the effort in Germany is building on artillery training Ukrainian forces had received from the U.S. elsewhere in Europe outside of Ukraine. The U.S. has been training Ukrainians on how to use howitzers, but could not disclose where that training was being held. The current training is taking place in Germany and two other undisclosed locations in Europe. We're talking about roughly 3 locations outside of Ukraine, and in this case, we can directly identify Germany as a site. Kirby said that 160 Florida National Guard troops that were stationed in Ukraine and pulled out before the Russia invasion will be doing the bulk of the training. Besides artillery, the Ukrainians will be training to use radar systems and armored vehicles. And, the training occurring in Germany is notable. It's also notable that the German government is allowing this to be publicly disclosed. Now, Poland has been far more public and enthusiastic about their support for Ukraine, and here we have them sending another 200 Soviet taints to Ukraine, and they're going to buy American-made Abrams taints to replace those. Important story from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Former U.S. Marine working for a military contractor killed in Ukraine. A 22-year-old citizen working for a private military contractor was killed in Ukraine fighting alongside Ukrainian forces against Russia, members of his family told CNN. Family members said Willie Joseph Cancel, a former U.S. Marine, was killed in combat on Monday. The CNN report didn't reveal the name of the contractor. Cancel's mother said the group of men was fighting were from all different countries. After signing up to fight, Cancel flew to Poland on March 12th and crossed the border into Ukraine the next day. When asked if the military contractor Cancel was working with was employed by the U.S. Defense Department, spokesperson John Kirby said, "Not that I am aware of." When asked if the Pentagon had any contractors working in Ukraine, Kirby again answered, "Not that I am aware of." Interesting that his answer isn't just no, although that, is also a way that he could just be saying no. The U.S. government has a history of using private military contractors in war zones. Most infamously, it used Blackwater in Iraq. If the U.S. is employing private military contractors in Ukraine against Russia, it will mark a serious escalation of Washington's role in the war. Former U.S. service members have also enlisted in the fight against Russia by joining Ukraine's newly created International Legion. In March, Ukrainian officials said more than 20,000 people across the world had joined the Legion. And as me and Will pointed out in March as well, groups that track the travels of extremist groups have noted that there's a lot of extremists moving into Ukraine. NATO says it's ready to back Ukraine against Russia for years, and we also had another Pentagon official saying that it was preparing Ukraine for the fight in the Donbass, that it believes it will be a long slog. And so this just goes to the fact that these countries are estimating that this is a years-long conflict and they are prepared to fight Russia the whole time. Next article by Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. Blast reported in Moldova breakaway state bordering Ukraine. A series of explosions have erupted at sites across Transnistria, a separatist-controlled region of Moldova which sits on the border on Ukraine's southern border. No one has claimed responsibility for the apparent attacks, which have stoked fears of a wider war in Eastern Europe. Authorities from the breakaway region have reported that at least five separate incidents so far this week, starting with several explosions at the Ministry of State Security headquarters in the region's capital on Monday. The blast resulted in a broken window but caused no casualties, the Interior Minister said, adding that according to the preliminary data, shots were fired from RPGs. Footage published from the ministry appears to show three men armed with shoulder-fired weapons who launched projectiles at the building before speeding away in a car. The region's president later dubbed the incident a terrorist attack, adding that nearby residential buildings were also damaged in the explosions. Also on Monday, a state investigative committee reported an attack on a military airfield claiming sabotage was carried out using an aircraft, presumably a drone, which dropped two explosives. It did not specify where the incident took place or name any responsible parties. In a village located 4 miles from the Ukrainian border, two blasts rocked a major radio station on Tuesday, disabling two large antennas. Local officials said there were no deaths or injuries. Also, they shared photos of the damaged towers. Officials reported damage to a military unit in a town west of the regional capital, according to the AP, though no offer further details. On the same day, the government escalated its color-coded terrorism threat level to red. I'm sure Americans will remember red level terrorist attack, saying that it would establish checkpoints along the perimeter of all cities and regions of the republic, while citing events that took place in the capital on April 25th, the village and a suburb of the capital on April 26th. Wednesday saw yet another apparent attack, with the Interior Ministry reporting shots were fired from the Ukrainian side of the border into a Moldovan town. Several drones were seen in the sky over the area. It's unclear what kind of weapons were used or who fired the shots, or whether the drones were spotted were military grade UAVs. Situated less than 2 miles from the border with Ukraine, the town is home to a major military ammunition dump housing 20 tons of Soviet-era weapons, thought to be among the largest military assets stored in Eastern Europe. The incident comes just days after a senior Russian military official declared that Moscow would not only seek to capture Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, but also the south of the country, and grant Russia access to the breakaway region of Moldova. And we covered this on the show in the past. Now, everybody's accusing everybody of being behind these attacks. I mean, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but basically, as Will points out, we don't have a whole lot of evidence at this point of who's all behind what. Now, one more thing on Ukraine I do want to talk about that's very important happening inside Ukraine. The AP reported on it today, is that Ukrainian authorities are going around rounding up anybody they claim is too sympathetic towards Russia. And, while there may be some legitimate concerns that there are people within Ukraine who are sympathizing with an invading power and potentially passing some kind of inappropriate information to Russia that way, and that would border on some kind of treason, but it seems that really what they're rounding up people for are, I wouldn't even say thought crimes, just not being enthusiastic enough about the Ukrainian war effort. And so this is very concerning. And it's important to remember that, despite the fact that U.S. officials present this as a battle of autocracy versus democracy, and the fact that, we have to repel the Russian invasion to save the great Ukrainian democracy, look, it could be wrong for Russia to invade Ukraine no matter what kind of government, even if they're a monarchy. That doesn't make it right for Russia to invade. It's just rhetoric. And Ukraine really isn't that much of a democracy. They ban the opposition political parties. They nationalize the media. They censor content that is, in the Russian language, are too pro-Russian in culture, media. This isn't a free country, and so we don't have to, go around claiming that. And at the same time, it doesn't make the people of Ukraine any less victims of the Russian aggression. And so that is, something worth pointing out here. All right, now the seized assets. This last article I have today from Dave DeCamp. Biden cedes to give power. Let me try this title one more time for y'all. Biden cedes the power to give Russian billionaires seized assets to Ukraine. President Biden is seeking the power to send assets of Russian billionaires that have been seized by the U.S. to Ukraine. The White House said that Biden has asked Congress to draft legislation that would streamline the process for the seizure of oligarchs' assets, explaining that assets subject to seizure to enable the proceeds to flow to Ukraine. Now, there's a couple of things that you could imagine going on here. One is going to be the fantasy of the U.S. war hawks, which is they're going to take money from billionaires who support the Putin war effort, benefit from the Putin war effort, are supporters of Vladimir Putin, and they're going to channel that money into Ukraine to make sure that the people who are suffering from Putin's war, the people who are displaced, starving, whose houses were destroyed, things like that, and they're going to give this money to them to help these people rebuild. What's actually going to happen is that the U.S. is going to enact large sweeping sanctions, steal money from a whole lot of wealthy Russians with varying ties to President Putin, and many of who will actually be in direct opposition to this war, and they're going to use it to fund the Ukrainian war effort. And I think that is the biggest problem in all of it. So very disturbing going on here, and it could be the kind of thing that provokes some kind of reaction from Moscow. Last article to talk about today is from myself and Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. U.S. strongly supports NATO membership for Finland and Sweden. The United States will welcome Helsinki and Stockholm into the NATO alliance with open arms. Washington's top diplomat told lawmakers Russia has warned of steep consequences should the Western military bloc further expand to 32 members. During a House committee hearing on Thursday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said both Finland and Sweden have a very strong interest to join NATO in the light of Russia's attack on Ukraine, noting that Washington would adhere to the alliance's open door policy for new members. We, of course, look to make that decision. If that's what they decide, we will strongly support it, Blinken said. Though he gave no timeline for when the two Nordic states might join, he said the subject is under very active consideration by both countries and that a formal decision could be made ahead of a NATO summit planned for Madrid this summer. And I think I saw last week Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com said that it could come as early as May. Stockholm appeared to move forward with a membership application with Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson declaring on Friday that her government would not only would not hold a referendum on the issue, and so there's going to be like no popular vote or anything to get in the way. A majority of the legislature backs NATO membership, while recent polling indicates a growing support among Sweden's public. In an interview with the Irish Times published Wednesday, Finland's foreign minister said most lawmakers strongly support joining the NATO alliance, even in the event Sweden decides not to join. Currently, I think the mood in Parliament, if you look at the majority of members of Parliament supporting the decision, is that yes, it includes the possibility to go without Sweden. It would also be good to do at the things at the same time as Sweden, but it depends on Swedish decisions. It is too early to guess the date, but I think before the summer we are proceeding. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has repeatedly said both countries could be rapidly admitted into the alliance should they apply, saying on Thursday he expects the process to go quickly. Finland's entrance into the military bloc would span the Russia-NATO border by over 800 miles. Moscow has vocally opposed that prospect, as well as all eastward exploration of the alliance, even threatening to deploy nuclear hypersonic weapons to the Baltic region in response to restore military balance. And so this is, we're looking at some pretty serious escalation here. All right, that'll wrap up the show for today. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. And remember, I got a bunch of upcoming events this week. May 4th, I am going to be speaking at Liberty on the Rocks in Denver at the Independence Institute. So if you're around the Denver area, come on out on Wednesday. I have any details. If you just want to DM me on Twitter or Facebook or send me an email, I will get back to you and let you know how to attend. Then Saturday, I'm in San Antonio with the Paloma Verde Los Libertinos event. I'm really looking forward to that. At the end of the month, I'm in Reno for the Libertarian Party convention, just attending, hanging out, and then I'll be in Freedom Fest the 13th through 16th of July. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Again, more shows later in the week.